Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-Futurism. Welcome back to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Callum Drysdale.
I'm Tomo. And the two of us are broadcasting to you in an age when British industry has fallen quiet.
Silence is the clanging of the foundries. Softened is the din of the shipyard.
Vanished is the mining that once dominated the Welsh steppe.
Today's guest, however, seeks to rouse the slumbering titan that is British industry.
Rian Chad Whitton is a research analyst who has particular expertise in automation, industrial policy, and energy markets. He works at Bismarck Analysis, writes on Substack under the name Dr. Syn, S-Y-N, and in March this year won the TXP Progress Prize for a swashbuckling essay on British energy policy.
Rian, welcome to the KC3.
It's a pleasure to be here, thank you.
Today we'll be talking about Ryan's plan to get those foundries firing again.
Ryan, so tell us briefly about the history of British industry. What, historically speaking, has made it special?
Britain does stand out as the original Promethean nation, the one that sort of unshackled humanity from the drudgery of pre-industrial life. We obviously see it starting in the 1800s, but we can really sort of go back to the 1500s. Then Britain is a relatively wealthy country by European and indeed global standards, but it's not particularly self-sufficient in things like glassmaking or in textiles. It's reliant on European expertise. This changes when John Dee comes back from Europe, becomes Elizabeth I astrologer, and from that period on, Britain really starts becoming a very weird country and a real outlier in terms of industrial development. We actually start using coal for home heating way before most other European countries do. Between 1570 and 1600, London really becomes, fired up by coal as opposed to wood. This allows for more wood to be used for our navy. Around 1700, Britain starts producing coal en masse. Around that time, Britain's producing about 80% of Europe's coal. This obviously moves our population up from the southeast and from the southwest, where it's traditionally been, and towards the north, because you have lots of coal deposits, you have the waterways to transport them. And so in textiles, in iron, we really become the first country to industrialize.
So this isn't just because we have a lot of coal naturally. We were unique in the sense that we were using the coal.
Yes, absolutely. We've often heard Britain described as sort of the original Saudi Arabia of coal. That's a completely unfair characterization from our perspective. Saudi Arabia obviously got its oil industry from British oil men and American bankers, whereas we, I think, through the introduction of the steam engine to pump water out of coal mines, we became a coal producer, I think, because of our technological ingenuity. Now, by the 1900s, with the expansion of electricity, industry has already begun to move back down south and into the Midlands. This is where cities like Birmingham and Coventry, and to a lesser extent Oxford, become real manufacturing hubs. And around the end of the Second World War, 1945, we're in a position where our heavy industry, located mainly in the Celtic regions and in the north, Wales, Scotland, the north of England, is struggling internationally. They aren't very cost competitive relative to countries that are sort of exporting steel and coal to the UK. So the heavy industry regions, namely Wales and Scotland, are already seeing very high unemployment, whereas the regions where light industry and discrete manufacturing like cars and chemicals, this is like Birmingham and so forth, are thriving. And so around 1945, certain government initiatives are put in place to try and deglomerate industry, to try and move industry that's successful from the Midlands to the north and to Wales and Scotland. This leads to quite significant inefficiencies, and the wider international picture isn't favourable to Britain. We've obviously lost our empire. We were heavily dependent on this sort of internal market to sell our goods. Upon losing that, we became a lot more exposed to foreign competition. You had countries like Japan and Germany that had very prominent industrial bases and relatively low wages for a long period of time from 1945 to 1975. And within that context, Britain's industrial competitiveness declines markedly for an extended period between 1945 and 1997, really. From then, you get the introduction of China into the WTO. You get a lot more free trade with China, and deindustrialization begins to accelerate quite a lot.
Decline is originally driven by the failure of the loss of the internal market, the high wages comparatively to our competitors and exposure then to competition?
To a great extent, yes. You also have internal decision making that is not conducive to actually making us competitive. So, for example, you have the 1945 Industry Act, which gives out permits for large industrial construction. This can only be spread over a certain number of regions. You can't concentrate industry too much in one area. And so you see quite distortive effects from that, to the point where, Birmingham, which was, one of the richest cities in Europe, really, is now...
Well, now one of the poorest.
Well,
right?
now one of the poorest, yes, and bankrupt as well, and not an industrial powerhouse. Aside from that, you have nationalisation, but you don't have rationalisation. So you don't have significant reforms in the management of companies like British Leyland. It's more a case of stitching different component failing organisations together and then expecting them to be successful.
Right, that scale in this case is not enough. There was needed to be more of a intelligent management process.
Exactly, and it's not concentrated enough. But you see instances, British Leyland's kind of a sick joke in the British history books these days. But you have British Leyland engineers like George Turnbull, developing the first Hyundai car, the first real major sort of South Korean car that was used for export, and being quite successful. So it's not really a case of lack of talent or lack of ingenuity. You have increased foreign competition and a lack of rationalisation at home. And I think that is still, to this day, sort of the key problem facing Britain.
This leads us on quite nicely to the question of British industry now, because we are told so often that Britain is no longer an industrial power. We're no longer a country that makes anything, that manufactures anything, that post-Thatcher we do services and that's it. I don't think you would agree with that. What are we still good at? Are there still some bright points among the maybe more grey? Are there maybe still some bright points left?
So just taking a bird's eye view, British industrial production today, measured in terms of gross value added, is about where it was in 2000, in real sort of price terms, right? Manufacturing value has sort of remained roughly stagnant for about 20 years. Britain still has some very significant industrial capacity. The largest industry is the chemical and pharmaceutical industry. It's incredibly high value and pays, very high wages relative to the number of workers. We have a significant food, drinks and beverage manufacturing industry, which is about 15% of our overall manufacturing GVA. And we still produce a reasonable number of cars and produce quite a lot of engines.
So I suppose, but these are different, right, to the typical view that people have of industry, that it is all smog-filled factories and large, loud, clanging hammers, isn't it?
Well, the food stuff is like the British sandwich industrial complex, isn't
yes.
it?
Yeah.
That's one of our great strengths.
No one puts something between two slices of bread better than us.
Well, we pioneered it in the 80s. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
In the 80s?
Yeah. That was when, I can't remember, you must read the Guardian long read, but that was when great innovations in sandwich construction occurred, such that 20 million office workers could all get their favourite sandwich at once every single day.
Oh, I thought you were referring back to the Earl of Sandwich. But actually, I've got a
friend of the show.
I've actually got a friend who's just completed a PhD in dropping tuna into pots, so that the correct amount of tuna is found in the pot. So actually, we are still cutting edge in that realm.
When you only get 95% of your requisite bit of tuna, then it does cast a pall over the rest of your day. So I'm glad someone goods on it.
No, the Cambridge academics are on that topic. And Ryan, what about, at risk of making George Stephenson spin in his grave, what are we bad at? Where has our productivity declined?
We no longer have a existing machine tool industry. That's one particular area. We did used to have a machine tool industry of some significance. They were, in fact, really invented and, popularized in Britain first. We don't have any presence in that space any longer.
And this is cordless power tools. This is large industrial machines.
Computer numerical control machines.
Right,
in big industrial lathes and things like that. Obviously, by a fact of not having very significant heavy industry, this is where the decline has been most apparent, right? In the production of steel, in aluminium, in shipbuilding, really sort of the backbone industries. That's where we've failed. And we've also, in part because of our very high industrial electricity prices, really declined as a refining power. And that leads on to being very behind the curve when it comes to any sort of industry related to net zero. Because net zero is really, for the most part, just the refinement and manufacturing and putting together of inorganic chemicals. So we only have two sort of battery plants related to automotives, and we have next to no capacity in the ability to refine chemicals for batteries. When we're thinking about where Britain's quite weak, it's really in that large-scale industrial capacity. We do have a car industry, around 900,000 cars produced a year, but compared to, say, France, which is about production capacity of 1.5 million cars, or Germany, which is closer to 3 million, we're lacking scale. While the car plants that we have are generally very productive, they're very highly distributed. So we actually have more car plants than France does, but we produce only 2/3 of the cars.
But I know that some people actually would say that this is a good thing, right? I know that the closing of the Port Talbot blast furnaces and their replacement with electric arc furnaces has reduced Wales's emissions by 15%. Many would say that this is a positive step for Britain. What would you say to that?
In relation to the transition from blast furnaces and basic oxygen furnaces to electric arc furnaces in Wales, the problem is that moving to electric arc furnaces increases the electricity intensity of the steelmaking process. And if your industrial electricity prices are particularly high, even in relation to Europe, the competitiveness remains incredibly low. And it still becomes essentially a game of the companies involved trying to extract subsidies, which is exactly what is happening. You could argue that it's less carbon intensive. But the problem with electric arc furnaces is that while new techniques are being developed to try and allow them to create higher grades of steel, if you want the very highest grades of steel, you need to make, steel from pig iron.
Right. You still have to use blast furnaces. I mean, this is what they say. We can no longer make virgin steel in electric arc furnaces.
Yeah. The other alternative to that is to use direct reduction iron techniques, where instead of using natural gas, you would use hydrogen. But we are talking about billions of pounds of investment for a process which is likely going to be far more expensive. So it's not really competitive. If you look at big countries with very significant steel industries, they will have a significant amount of electric arc furnaces, and that will be the majority of new capacity that's being built. But they still have a very significant base of blast furnaces and basic oxygen furnaces.
Rian, Callum and I are always saying to each other that one of the key measures of a country's industrial prospects is R&D spending. So we're curious, how does Britain's R&D spending stack up against peer nations?
Just looking at British private R&D spending, right? It's a very interesting thing has happened in where there's been some changes to the methodology.
I should probably jump in and clarify that R&D is research and development.
Yes. And we're focusing here on private research and development from companies. Obviously, these are skewed towards industrial companies because it's generally a far more research intensive process. What's interesting is that in 2022, 2023, there was a change to the methodology, which implied that there was actually a huge amount of private R&D going on in Britain that hadn't previously been covered, largely by small and medium-sized enterprises. And so the amount of private investment as a percentage of GDP in the UK went up from 1.7% to 2.4% overnight. It was a huge sort of shift.
The greatest day in British innovation.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Kingdom Brunel, eat your heart out.
Suddenly the electricity prices tumbled overnight.
Financial engineering.
The ONS can be thanked as the most significant driver of British innovation.
That was actually the day that we built the King Charles III.
There is a bit of skepticism around this new methodology. It's very contentious. There's, also been significant upward revisions in the amount of money lost due to fraud from R&D credit schemes, up from about 300 million per annum to about 1 billion. This is from the Treasury.
So basically people are saying we're doing innovative work, and actually what they're doing is practicing how to crumple up paper better.
Yeah, just out of interest, how do you go about fleecing the Treasury for this money?
Well, there's clear and obvious fraud, but there is a significant possibility. The difference between the old methodology and the new methodology is in large part down to what are essentially normal business practices, such as market research, being counted as research and development.
It's a very high-tech field these days, right?
Absolutely. But even if we look and take the new methodology at face value, there is a point about British research and development being quite different to that of other countries. So just looking at like the EU sort of has this like R&D investment tracker for, 2,500 really big players. In the case of Britain, we have about 120 companies on this list. France has about 70, and Germany has the same number, about 120. And yet France spends more on R&D than we do in terms of private investment, and Germany spends over double. So I think what we see in Britain is really a lack of very big, significant industrial companies that are very R&D intensive. If we're looking at the big companies that are on Britain's list here, it's BP and Shell, who are not very research intensive.
They've figured out how to dig the holes, haven't they?
Well, they don't even do that. That's the oil field services companies, the Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and so forth, right? So they're the ones doing most of the innovation in fracking. And then you've got Unilever, which is obviously a big food and beverage manufacturer, but is not very innovative. And then you have HSBC and financial services companies. Now, they do spend a bit on R&D, but it's not their job to do intensive R&D. It's their job to facilitate that through lending. Where we do have, some very significant R&D spenders is GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca. Now, obviously, these are, quite global, companies. They have about 10% of their workforce in Britain, but a lot of the breakthroughs that happen for both those companies are still related to research in the UK, even if pretty much all their revenue and profits come from the US drugs market.
But the difference here is that Germany is pumping out innovations as how to have an even better seat heater kind of thing.
Yes. Germany, you could basically split in half between its automotive industry and the rest of its economy. But if you actually split out all the research and development from automotive companies, it would still be a large corporate research spender than Britain.
And what on earth could be driving this? Is this just because we are lazy? Because this is what I think people often call the British curse of low productivity, isn't it? That we really dislike putting money into research and instead tend to just like throwing cheap, unskilled labour at problems.
Yeah,
or maybe we're just the most conscientious accountants, right? Isn't that one argument about our productivity? So the argument is that we keep more accurate figures on our outputs than other countries, and that makes us look bad.
Well, it's a valid point.
Have you been to France or Italy?
Yes. And, then you also see people constantly reference Chinese patents, right? Like as a measure of sort of innovation and in sort of like progress in science. And it's often very dubious because they're often being, incentivized to file as many patents as possible. But I think the productivity puzzle, such as it is in Britain, is really largely explainable by the relative decline of industries where productivity growth tends to be higher, right? So from 1981 to 2023 in Britain, the average annual productivity growth of the chemicals industry is about 7.5% per year, right? If you look at something like media, which has grown, it's more on 1% per year. If you look at architectural and engineering services, and obviously we're a services superpower, it's basically flat. Right? Now, it's not as if our manufacturing sector has massively slowed down in terms of its productivity growth. It's just that it makes up a much smaller component of our economy than it previously did.
Right. So by choosing to become a services economy, we've basically backed the horse who's had a rum tummy and only got 3 legs.
Well, it's all a matter of degrees, right? Like every economy could be termed a service economy just by raw numbers and consumption spending. But I think you can make the case that even compared to other Western countries, manufacturing takes up a very tiny part of Britain's overall economy. It's around 8%, right? For the US, it's over 10%. For France, it's over 10%. For Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, these, very rich Northern European countries on which we, should probably be comparing ourselves, it's significantly higher between, 13 to 20%.
So, Ryan, as you say, there are some disparities between British industrial performance and that of peer countries. But isn't that just the way of the world? Does the modern global economy not demand that we specialise in our individual ways?
There's no Rotterdam laundromat for Russian corrupt money.
Someone's got to do it.
It's important to qualify, yes, there is an argument being put forward that when we look at, how to make Britain better, there is just too much focus on manufacturing. the Resolution Foundation is really sort of, the key organization making this argument that we're focusing way too much on this and saying that, politicians spend so much time going around factories, they never focus on what Britain's actually good at.
Well, yeah, Warhammer or Games Workshop, who make Warhammer, is one of Britain's most successful companies, but rarely do you see Rishi Sunak posing as a space marine.
Yeah. That's a valid point. And no one obviously wants to talk about how fantastic we are at gambling, right? No one.
Well, yeah, but there is a difference between Warhammer and Steel, right? Steel is commonly regarded as central to national security.
Yeah, and I think that the problem with the Resolution Foundation's point is that, yes, politicians know that it's very important to seem like you're very interested in reindustrialising Britain and manufacturing. You are far more likely to spot a British parliamentarian in a hard hat and a high-vis jacket than a Chinese official. But the interest is a mile wide and a foot deep, I think. And the Resolution Foundation basically argues that specialisation is very sticky, it's very hard to change the economy, we should primarily focus on services. But it even acknowledges in its papers that the overemphasis on services does create regional inequality, because these service sectors, particularly the high-value ones like finances, are very reliant on network effects. They've pretty much got to be monopolised by London. And I think if we were going to have the very skewed service economy that we have had since, the 1990s, I don't see how you can possibly have any kind of levelling up strategy that isn't just redistribution of productive areas to unproductive areas.
Well, and then you get the same problems that we had, as you said, in the 70s and 80s, where we force productive industries to go to unproductive areas and they collapse, right?
Absolutely, yes. And we often think of industrial jobs as very old-fashioned, not particularly high value. And then we think of new jobs, related to finances, related to legal, and related to arts and culture as very high value. But in general, this doesn't actually stack up. So I recall the Thick of It producer, Armando Iannucci, making a point on Twitter about the government cutting funding for the arts and saying, this is 6% of GDP, it's employing, 2.3 million people. You're absolutely mad to defund it. This should be front and center. This is what we should be focused on. Now, obviously, what's called like creative industries usually gets muddled with IT, which generally confuses the figures to the point where people think that the arts is, producing, 6% of GDP. It's instead, it's more like 2%. But then even if we take the creative sector and look at, IT and muddle that in with tourism and with the arts and so forth, it might be 6% of GDP, but it's 7% of the labour force, right?
Right. So actually, these people are quite unproductive for the amount of population that they're actually employing.
You could put it that way. You could also say they're generally often not getting paid that much, right? And, from the ONS, if we just look at weekly wages, right, in the arts sector, weekly wages are about £490, right, versus about £560 in education and about £320 in food services, right? So these are not well-paying sectors by and large. We get this skewed sense that the arts sector must be sort of, very high salary. For the most part, the job's pretty low paid.
I'd like to bring it back to this security question because people do mention it in relation to manufacturing. Say NATO were to get dragged into a war with Russia. I'm not sure that we would need that many more podcasters, apart from those of the very patriotic variety, to step up. But we might need things like steel, right? Mm. Like this stuff does seem pretty important to our national security. Like this is the argument for one of the arguments for subsidizing British steel, isn't it? That we keep the industry on our shores in case we really need it at some point.
Yes, and the highest grades of steel, obviously, because that's what you need for submarines and for aircraft. Yeah, look, if you wanted to run a fully service-based economy and just import like all the manufactured goods, you can do that, but I don't think you can then also be, a military power, right? You can sort of be a transactional mercenary nation that just does business with whoever, but that's not really where the British elite really want to be. They want to be sort of part of, a military alliance. They want to be standing down Russia. They want to be deterring, China in the South China Sea and so forth. And yeah, like when you look at Britain's military capacity, We obviously have fantastic soldiers, but if you look at the hardware, we've got about 200 Challenger 2 main battle tanks right now, and only a portion of those are functional. Now,
and even fewer of them are being upgraded to Challenger 3s.
Exactly, right? And, if you take the Ukraine-Russia war, obviously it's a horrible war, but any sort of conventional war between Western powers and the Russians would be far grander in scale and probably far more, bloody in terms of casualties. Just based on open source estimates, Ukraine's lost about 900 tanks and the Russians about 3,000. So 200 main battle tanks that we currently have just isn't going to stack up to much. So yes, ultimately military capability is downstream from industrial capacity.
Well, and we see this in Europe, right, where there's been real struggles to bring ammunition manufacturing back online. We had a guest previously who said that we would win a war against Germany because whilst we only have 5 days of ammunition stores, they only have 2.
Exactly. And you can apply that to differences in shipbuilding capacity between China and the West. You have members of the United States Navy actually touring South Korean shipyards and trying to get Hyundai Heavy Industries to invest in shipyard capacity in the United States.
Well, it's something like 90% of all shipbuilding capacity is now in China, isn't it?
It's split. So it's about 40% in China, about 30% in South Korea, and then another 20% in Japan.
Right, okay.
Yeah. But then for the high value, like LNG tankers, that high value stuff, that's majority run by South Korean shipyards. So it can be done outside China.
Say we did decide we're not going to be a military power, we're not going to worry about manufacturing, we'll go services, we'll be a sort of an offshore Switzerland that doesn't worry about any of these things. Is it possible to have low engineering economy that can be high growth, do you think?
Well, Switzerland obviously does have a thriving industrial sector, right? Besides pharmaceuticals, it's also very heavily automated and has a lot of functioning robotics companies. And obviously ABB, which is Europe's biggest robot producer, as well as a big producer of, major equipment for like transformers and CNC machines, is Swedish. Yeah, Switzerland's not actually the best example. I think that is an option, but it's deeply unsatisfactory to pretty much anyone outside the city of London, I would argue.
Well, we get this, I think people have called it as the Deliveroo economy, right? Where you have a few people who are able to reap enormous rewards from these jobs and everyone else is left serving them coffee and delivering poke bowls to them.
That is the trajectory for Britain, I would say. And the idea is that you can have so much growth in the centre that you can just redistribute that across the country. Or you can do other things, right? So you can essentially treat importing people via universities as a form of service export. But I think ultimately, if we hope to build our own King Charles III space station and conquer the stars, that kind of economy is not going to achieve that.
I find what you said about distribution very interesting. It seems that manufacturing by its nature has to be distributed broadly, geographically. And so that means that it's better financially distributing the proceeds of the economy than a services economy, which is physically centralized.
Well, it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, based on what we did from 1945 onwards, we diversified it too much, right? We distributed factories that should have been going to Birmingham, to Manchester and Scotland and Wales. Harold Macmillan, I think, even distributed factories that were supposed to be going solely to Wales and split them up so that half the factories went to Scotland instead, right? Britain's a very odd case in that it kind of breaks Zipf's law, the idea that, the second city sort of has half the GDP of the capital city.
Yeah, there's a power law scaling relationship in terms of size and GDP.
Yeah.
But we did this deliberately to Birmingham, didn't we?
Yes, absolutely. And that was done in the name of industrial deglomeration, right? And sort of treating industrial policy as a place-based sort of scheme, to try and basically, some people would call it redistribution, some people would call it port barrel politics, some people would say that it was done for fear of Scottish separatism and incentives like that. But ultimately, it left us with a much less competitive industry. And, Birmingham, which was a net contributor to the UK, is now a significant net debtor. So while I think that manufacturing and industry, do distribute wealth better than just being fully oriented towards services as we currently are, that shouldn't be seen as the primary reason for having a lot of industry. The primary reason should be that it provides a lot of good jobs, increases productivity growth, and will make us significantly richer overall. There will be plenty of towns that aren't going to, recover from deindustrialization. But I think through essentially building one or two significant hubs, you can actually, get a lot of benefits.
I can imagine there might be spillover effects as well. So if a factory makes particularly good and versatile robots, then they can be repurposed elsewhere, and like the whole economy benefits. And this is maybe not so true of other sectors.
Yes, and not to mention that manufacturing jobs tend to create a lot of service jobs as well in places that they wouldn't otherwise be.
Well, someone's got to serve the sandwiches to the factory
Exactly.
floor workers.
Well, I mean, I think it's a point to consider that at the moment, the southeast and London is the only net contributor, right? Every other region in Britain takes more money from the centre than it gives back in. So if we could flip even one of these, that would be a significant improvement.
Yeah, of course, we have three regions, which is the Northeast, Wales and Northern Ireland, that have been serious net debted regions for an extended period of time. And that's unlikely to change. But you can look at other regions, certainly the east of England, sort of, Cambridge, Norwich, and that area, and then the West Midlands via Birmingham, and there the situation has deteriorated quite severely. You're not going to be able to redistribute wealth and level up the entire country. In a sense, leveling up something we've been trying since 1945 with, very negative effects
Via this redistribution.
Via distribution. Leveling up is also a bit of a misnomer because it's quite deceptive to believe that you can get the whole of the UK kind of up to the level of sort of industrial capacity or service capacity of the southeast and London. But you can have one or two regions which will be, significantly more productive.
We're taking steps. There's a new high-speed rail line that's going to go all the way to Birmingham from London.
Yes.
But I suppose that's continuing the problem, isn't it? That you are, at that point, you're merely trying to bring people into London and expand London's access to workers rather than making Birmingham itself a productive zone.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there are some people, I think, who say that given that we industrialized first, it's almost right and proper that we deindustrialize first, that actually our massive progress in net zero and decarbonisation should be viewed as real success stories.
The problem with anything post, right, is that there's nothing after the post, right? Modernism, then postmodernism. There's nothing after postmodernism. There's industrialization and post-industrialization. There's nothing after it, really, that's clear and positive. I think, Britain obviously has decarbonized to a far greater extent than virtually any major European country in terms of like the drop in the emissions over the last 20 years. You could argue that France, because it built out its nuclear very early on, is already less carbon intensive, but we've certainly done a better job of it than Germany. But about 40% of that is just offshoring emissions, right? It's moving, industrial processes and production to East Asia, right? Now, we can say that plus the building out of, wind and solar has, led us to become an even smaller component of global carbon emissions than we already are, which is about 1.5%. What does this translate into in terms of leverage or soft power? If I was China and a British dignitary came to me and told me, what I have to do to get to net zero, I'd be looking at him and going, well, who on earth are you?
Well, and if it means following your pattern of deindustrializing, no thank you, right?
Yes. And, in the one hand, we've deindustrialized and decarbonized in sync, right? And these two are connected, right? Like China obviously has by far and away the largest capacity for heavy industry in the world. And you get to a point where close to about 50% of all chemical revenues come directly from China. That's for the whole global chemical industry. Same with steel. Over 50% of the production is Chinese. Same with aluminium. Same with, refined lithium and for batteries. And the fact is, heavy industry allows you to very cheaply produce at scale the solar cells, the batteries, and the wind turbines that are being marketed as the herald of this new green industrial revolution. So, there's a lesson there. Like, if you actually want to, have a stake in industries of the future, you have to have that foundational baseline of industrial capacity, which we haven't done. We've talked about being a leader in green technology while not having that sort of foundational industrial capacity that would actually allow us to be a player in solar panel production or in wind turbine production.
Right, because a company spinning up would be doing it from way further back than a Chinese company where there's experience in doing this large-scale manufacturing.
Yes, and some people would also argue significant overcapacity and just an absolute deluge of subsidies from state and local governments. So,
well,
thank you, Ryan. That concludes the first half of the podcast. We will come back to talk about the future of industry across the world and how Britain can take her slice.
Tom, have you ever felt that test match cricket is just too short?
Always.
Or that it occurs in too few dimensions?
Every day.
Then now's the time to buy your ticket to the next space test. It lasts multiple decades and spans several cubic light years of space. And because the boundary is three-dimensional, it features fielders who wear jetpacks. Enthusiasts are calling it the only true way to enjoy red ball cricket. If you're a real fan, membership of the Surrey Cricket Club earns you the right to sit in the members' stands at the newly completed Kia Ouroboros ground. You can mix with the players in the tea room and maybe even shake the robotic hand of the resurrected W.G. Grace. For those of you unable to attend, never fear. It will be broadcast over Test Match Special, and you can even send cake to the presenters directly via the Food Facts 8000. And we are back, listeners. Ryan, I think there's sometimes a tendency in a lot of industrial policy to fight maybe yesteryear's war, that politicians might look back and say, if only we had got on board, say, the semiconductor industry back in the 60s and 70s, we'd be in a great place. But actually, that's no longer the way we should be thinking. What industries do you think politicians nowadays are overemphasizing in Britain?
No, it's a very valid point. Well, obviously, we did try very hard at semiconductors. Obviously, the Welsh Development Agency tried to bring LG, big South Korean chip developer, to Wales, which ultimately didn't work. I don't think it's a case of certain technologies or industries being overrated. You can obviously look at average wages and kind of determine which industries are going to give you the best bang for your buck. Food and beverage manufacturing generally pays less than, chemical and pharmaceutical manufacturing. We can make terms like that. I think the problem we have in the current moment is that everyone's essentially decided that industrial policy is a great thing and they're all going to pursue largely the same technologies, which is sort of the green technology stack. And so I think in a way, while it was criticised as being very lackluster, Rishi Sunak's very milquetoast, 1 or 2 billion sort of spend on semiconductors was actually probably the right way to go. Ultimately, Britain is not going to have any capacity to build large chip fabrication plants for the foreseeable future, since they cost about 10 or 15 billion. You have Americans and Germans paying TSMC, really...
This is the Taiwanese massive semiconductor producer.
About 60% of chip capacity for the high-end chips and about 90% for the really high-end chips. Yeah, you have the German government and the American government really showering them, billions and billions of dollars just to set up factories and plants in their respective countries. And given the lack of competitiveness for those two countries, I don't think Britain, spending 20 billion on fabrication plants would be very wise. I think there's also a sad reality that we are not in a position to develop batteries at scale. That market is completely dominated by the Chinese, and the rest is just hoovered up by Japanese and South Korean companies.
Well, largely because of these subsidies, right? That vast amounts of money is being put in by the government, which allows them to sell at much lower rates on the international market.
To a great extent, yes. You also have the fact they have very cheap electricity. Obviously, in all three of those major East Asian economies, you have a fair amount of coal-based electricity production. You also have a growing portion of nuclear electricity production. And you do have lots of intermittents, solar and wind, but they haven't penetrated a very large part of the market yet. And so the grid balancing costs and the transmission costs that come with that haven't really broken through. Not to mention the fact that the grid companies and the utility companies that run those three economies are all heavily subsidized and are basically controlled by the state.
I mean, the point you're making here is that when you have highly electricity dependent and demanding industries, the cost of your power determines whether you are economical or not.
Yes, and sometimes that's just a case of your electricity mix. Coal, despite obviously being very dirty, it's an established technology. It's very easy to build new coal plants, and it's very cheap. Not to mention the fact that these utilities often get considerable government subsidies. And so were Britain to try and enter that subsidy rat race, I think we'd come out very disappointed. Ultimately, it's not really about this or that technology from where I'm standing. I think, Britain has very severe problems related to planning, relating to, adequate space to build the factories, and it lacks real industrial players that can be sort of relied upon to invest in Britain over the long term.
And again, thinking about the global economy, are there any wilder punts that countries should be considering taking?
When it comes to taking wide punts on technology, we've done that in some form since 2012, right? We've had like the 8 great technologies. We've had the 9.
What technologies?
We've had the 8 great technologies. We've expanded it to 9 to add things like quantum computing. We've then reduced it down to 7 and changed the taxonomy. And,
So the 8 great technologies are AI and semiconductors, satellites and space, robotics, etc.
Yes. And we can definitely make the case that, right, we need to get good at some of these technologies, right? Britain obviously has a lower sort of density of robots per 10,000 manufacturing workers than the global average. So it's not merely a case of not being world leading. We're actually sort of below the world average in terms of our adoption of robots. Just having, maybe a few plants related to robot production, maybe some production related to the servo motors that power the robots. These are all things that would be very good. But what we probably need is an increase in the number of system integrators that can actually deploy robots at scale and be hired to actually install robots at factories at scale.
Well, I thought this was the promise of Ocado, that they were going to, that via the sandwich assembly route, we're going to bring automation to Britain.
Yeah, and that shows the challenge. Now, Ocado did buy a number of American companies, which, related to sort of pick and place, and then also sort of moving robots about, autonomous mobile robots, AGVs and so forth. They also spent a bit too much money on self-driving cars for a portion of time. But automation is very challenging and very often loss-making for a considerable period of time. And, it's often been deployed in 2 industrial sectors more than any other, which is automotive and electronics. And these are relatively high value.
As in on the assembly lines?
Yes, yeah. And even then, they've been deployed most in the biggest factories that the world has, right? So, South Korea has the highest density of industrial robots. It's no surprise that, the Hyundai factory that it has is the largest car plant by capacity, on the planet. And so, you've had loads of companies, from Tesla to General Motors, lose significant amounts of money by trying to automate, too much, too early, or in too haphazard a fashion.
Well, it sounds then that automation would be a fool's game. Why would you not just employ more people? What is the advantage of robots and automation? Because, and I will add, given that we are also the country where the Luddites first arose, are they not also the cause of the loss of jobs?
In the long term, automation is heavily correlated with growth in industrial productivity and improved export competitiveness, right? So South Korea, Singapore, Japan, Germany, Sweden, all these countries are automating at a very high rate. And what you generally find, or the literature generally finds, is that companies that automate generally keep a very large number of jobs because their productivity increases, they keep expanding, they employ more people, and it's generally their competitors that don't automate as fast that very often go out of business. It's very notable. Has anyone heard of the, great decline in manufacturing workers in the automotive industry worldwide? It's gone from maybe 8 million workers globally in 2000 to about 13 million today. In the United States, the number of automotive workers is about what it was in the 1990s. This is after the China shock. This is after NAFTA. This is after a lot of automation. There's really no evidence at this present time that large-scale automation, leads to basically a jobs apocalypse.
Why might it be that there are fewer people on the assembly line, but more people doing paperwork around them?
Yeah. The number of manufacturing or production workers relative to managers has stayed relatively constant throughout that whole period of time. If we look at where manufacturing job losses have been heaviest, right? Britain, in terms of the actual manufacturing labour force, from 1999 to now, it's declined by over half. It's declined far more precipitously than in countries that have automated a great deal, Germany, Sweden, and so forth. So I think ultimately robots destroy jobs in countries that don't employ robots, I think.
Right. Someone else's robot destroys your job rather than the robot you yourself build.
Yes.
So automation is not a magic bullet, but Ryan, let's talk about what would work. How can Britain pull herself from her industrial morass? If you were Prime Minister, what levers would you be pulling?
Starting at the bottom, really, in relation to energy. Well, I think reducing Britain's industrial electricity prices is probably the one thing that you should be most laser focused on. I think this will require some reassessment of our current net zero strategy. Now, obviously, net zero, decarbonisation, these things are all good. But looking at, say, the National Grid's plan for 2050, which essentially is about moving to wind and solar with a lot of backup from hydrogen, if you look at the projections, they're anticipating really stagnant industrial demand. They're anticipating about 1.5% GDP growth per annum. They're not anticipating significant population growth. Essentially, we have a very constrictive National Grid energy policy, which I think will just make our electricity more expensive relative to the rest of the world, going forward. I think that an increase in firm power capacity via nuclear plants, would be a sensible thing to do. This is being sort of positioned by, the Tony Blair Institute as well, saying, we need, 60 gigawatts of nuclear capacity. Obviously, this requires large-scale state reform whereby you have the planning reforms in place to actually make, nuclear power viable. It also means fast-tracking, designs from the South Koreans, which are currently not yet approved by the relevant British authorities.
Power stations, that is.
Yes. And essentially, you're going to have to import nuclear expertise from South Korea or other countries at scale and at significant pace to actually build out firm power capacity to induce industrial electricity prices. And that's going to cost, in the short term, a fair amount of money.
But there's also a need for cultural change, isn't there? That at the moment we have small companies or non-research driven companies, and we need to instead move to models that are seen more abroad, where you have big companies that are constantly striving to be at the cutting edge. And I think that what you wrote in your essay, the lack of British bigness, is a really interesting start. In Asia, there are these things. What would they look like to have a Kidderminster chaebol, for example?
Absolutely. So chaebols in South Korea, the most well-known is Samsung, but you also have Hyundai, you have LG, and you have SK. Essentially, these are sort of, informal associations of affiliate companies, which are controlled through, a mixture of cross-shareholding and, just holding company mechanisms. But essentially, they cover, entire supply chains. They're not really companies. They are, bespoke supply chains in and of themselves. So
they're vast, aren't they? It's the sort of thing that if you can get in as a young graduate, your career is set because you just rise through these vast business empires.
Or you stay with the one affiliate company forever and never sort of move from it. But, an example would be Hyundai. Now, Hyundai is split into 4 separate chaebols now. Since its founder, passed away in, 2001. But essentially, if you bring all those companies together and then just rack up their revenues, you're approaching something like 400 billion, which is comparable to Walmart or Amazon or the very biggest American companies. And they are certainly accused of crony capitalism a great deal. Right? They do have, a symbiotic relationship with local governments. They sometimes have an adversarial relationship with the government when, the public's very angry about them because of, corruption, things like that. But you have other examples in Germany, right? Volkswagen plays this role. And you have European countries like Sweden, which are, much as in South Korea, dominated by essentially industrial aristocracies. In Sweden, it's the Wallenbergs through their holding company Investor AB. And through that, they hold shares in, Saab, which is a defense manufacturer, in AstraZeneca as well. Now, this is, sometimes referred to as kind of, crony capitalism or corporatism. But I think that there's something to it that, is quite viable for reintroducing manufacturing into the UK. If we look at Denmark or Sweden, they have, essentially industrial foundations. These can be either run on a family model, or it can be run through like a more standard corporate model where it's not tied to any specific family. But essentially it means that, company profits can go to a foundation, and that foundation has to spend a lot of money on philanthropic purposes, which can often include R&D and things like that. And generally the way it's set up is these businesses get preferential treatment by their governments. They get a lot of government influence, but they also have to invest in the country itself. Right, so the Wallenbergs are the biggest R&D spender in Sweden. The Novo Nordisk Foundation is by far the biggest private R&D spender in Denmark.
It's something of a symbiotic relationship, isn't it? That these companies feel great loyalty and connection to the countries that they're based, and then, due to their special privileged status, reinvest in their own country in order to start just sort of spinning the flywheel of prosperity.
Yes, and industrial policy, the problem in Britain is I think that we see industrial policy through the lens of papers and outlining different technology groups to look at, and, how to create this hub here or that hub there. But industrial policy really is more of a relationship between government and corporate elites, right? And you could also include unions in that, right? It's ultimately a compromat between those two interest groups.
And when you're saying we need a bit more power to the captains of industry, they need to be revived.
Get them back in their top hands.
Yes. No, essentially so. In Britain, if you look at like the top rich list, you do obviously have people like Jim Ratcliffe and James Dyson, although they feel like a weird niche in that they've now, at least spend quite a lot of their time outside of Britain, right? I think, Jim Ratcliffe, Monaco; for James Dyson, it's Singapore. And these were two people that were sort of very heavily involved in, pushing for Brexit. But if you listen to them now, they seem to basically be of the view that they are peripheral figures who have absolutely no influence in government decision-making and have no effective relationship with, BEIS or any government department and so forth. So they essentially are, peripheral figures in British public life. And that's not the case in, a lot of countries where industry is a lot more productive and successful.
Right, that actually the German Jim Ratcliffe would have the ear of local politicians who would be ready and willing to hear what he had to say about where to build factories, where to employ more people, or how education could be changed in order to put out more workers.
Yes, and that would obviously affect planning laws, and it would affect regulations too. You may have had to make some sacrifices on the case of net zero because, for example, you probably wouldn't be able to have a moratorium on fracking in Lancashire, right? Since that was something that INEOS, wanted to pursue, quite heavily.
Because otherwise it would miff Jim.
Well, it would miff Jim, exactly. Right?
So we're getting a sense of your priorities: bring down energy costs, make it easier for big conglomerates to be a big part of the economy. Let's also talk about other opportunities you've written about. You wrote that the biggest opportunity in domestic metals is the mining of gold in northern Wales. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, obviously this is a micro scale, change that would be positive. But yeah, I mean, Wales, generally not known, but actually Welsh gold, which has been sort of mined since 1923, I think it is, and is, frequently used by the royals, is actually very valuable, even relative to sort of other gold deposits. And there is actually a mine there that is sort of, ready to be mined, but it's actually been blocked by local authorities. And one just sees that and thinks, well, Wales is a relatively poor region. A bit of gold prospecting wouldn't, do the region down any.
And there's an Anglo-Futurist podcast plan to relieve it of much of its stone, which would expose these rich seams of valuable metals.
Well, can you imagine a Welsh gold rush? In a similar way, you can't
have a Welsh golden hoard without a Welsh gold rush.
Sort of people heading out in very baggy jeans and their six-shooters out to Carmarthen.
This is what you're unleashing on the country, Ryan.
Well, British mining, I mean, this is an important point, right? Britain talks more about human capital than pretty much any European country, right? You spend more on like primary and secondary education than Germany by a percentage point of GDP. And yet we actually haven't been able to train any new miners, right? Or any new mining graduates. We have one mining school in the country, Camborne, like down at the University of Exeter. And in 2020, it actually paused new applicants because it wasn't getting any. And this speaks to a wider point that British industry, as I sort of said, is muddling through, right? Like if you actually looked at, just the lines, you would see, essentially stagnant output, over the last 20 years. And you could say, this isn't terrible, right? This is manageable. When the golden generation of boomers finally moves on to their pensions, I think you'll start to see quite a severe deterioration, right? And mining is just sort of like one example of that. You could also see that in our nuclear industry too.
Because we're just not training these new people to have the skills that currently will just die off.
Well, does it matter? Does it matter? Does human capital matter when AI is going to replace a lot of that intellectual work? I wouldn't accuse recent governments of prescience, and clearly we need more miners. But there's going to be a reallocation.
Well, I'd like to see a ChatGPT swing a pickaxe first, Tom. Maybe.
Well, we'll see a robot do it.
Yeah. Look, so making claims about what jobs AI is going to fill or what robots are going to fill. The problem is, as you say, we're not prescient enough to really understand what jobs are going to be made redundant, if indeed many are. Generally, when jobs are being made redundant, it doesn't usually happen overnight. Like people who sort of managed elevators and just operated elevators were around for a long time after elevators became fully automatic. So,
well, and the stair builders are still around.
Yes, indeed. I wouldn't rely on Sam Altman to come to the rescue and fill the gap that our education system leaves open. And I think the fact that Britain has pushed for more graduates as a percentage of the population than pretty much any major European country, certainly Germany, but still has these terrible shortages in these, very discrete sectors, it sort of shows the strategy isn't working.
Well, it's a cultural problem, isn't it? That these bright young graduates, even the ones studying chemical engineering, studying maths, studying mechanical engineering, are not being driven towards the hard application of their skills, but instead go and become spreadsheet monkeys, don't they? They become powered into professional services.
But the only sensible response to this problem is not to chide young people for not being interested in these industries. It's to ask which levers of government can be pulled to entice them, isn't it? How do we get bright young people to work in important industries like mining?
Yes. So, I mean, there are a number of things you could look at, right? I mean, the fact that tuition fees are fairly universal across different subjects, might be something that we want to look at, whereby you have deductions if you're, studying sectors that are considered, of particular importance to the government. You could even frame this, from a sort of national security perspective, isn't it? Like it could be, the national security deduction, if you're going into mining or,
or English literature.
Or English literature or steelmaking or media studies. Yeah. So I think that's, something that we should definitely be considering. I think ultimately, while education and making reforms around that is maybe important, ultimately got to say we need to make the platform that makes sort of industrial build out possible, right?
Well, it has to, but surely it has to become sexy. It's not just enough to pull levers in government. We have to get people wanting to do these jobs.
Yeah. We have to get people understanding that drilling very deep holes is very exciting and pro-social. I've made this case so many times on this podcast, and still the public has not woken up to it.
Yes. Well, yeah, there's certainly a lot could be done on marketing. Although I think the positive thing is that obviously we are a child of the American empire these days. And in the US, you are essentially seeing manufacturing become, at least to a very niche community, sexy, right? So perhaps the fact that we are so derivative of the Americans means that 5 to 10 years down the line, it will be sexy in the UK.
Well, I suppose in the same way that we've churned out a generation of software engineers who are now struggling to find work, maybe in 10 years' time, similarly, there'll be mechanical engineers.
We can send those software engineers over to Wales. They yearn for the mines.
Well, yeah. So we had Silicon Roundabout as a derivative of Silicon Valley. So maybe we'll have our own El Segundo or something. Maybe it'll be in Folkestone or Bournemouth or somewhere.
Ryan, we'll be counting on you to come up with a similarly alliterative name.
Brian, now that we've put British industrial policy to rights, we will leave it there. But where can listeners stay in touch with you and read more of your work?
So I'm on X, formerly Twitter, and you can read any stuff I write on Dr. Syn on Substack. That's Dr. Syn.
Award-winning Substack, no less.
Britons, pick up your pickaxes, go forth and make something. Thank you to listeners of our first series. Tom will be in the United States carrying out light industrial espionage, but hopefully will return with the panacea to all of our problems. But until then, we will say goodbye and thank you for listening.